Okay, so I hope this slide is visible to you now.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, all right. So you will recall that, in the last lecture, we had just started to talk about the subject matter or about what environmental biotechnology actually means. So today, of course, there are a lot of technological developments in the area of environmental biotechnology. But if you look at the history of the field, it started almost as early as at the end of the 19th or early 20th century, when people started to use some kind of a methodology for treatment of the wastewaters. Okay, so we can tentatively say that the field of environmental biotechnology began around this particular area. And what it involved at that time was identifying microbes as well as microbial processes in the treatment process. And that is how in the wastewater treatment, we talk about activated sludge treatment. And that is nothing but the oxidative microbes which are able to oxidize much of the food material which is in there. So that's why we say that it started with identification of microbes as well as their biochemistry or the microbial processes. So we can easily say that that is where we began the field of environmental biotechnology. Now, the point which I want to make here in this slide is that pollution, you may think that pollution could be a very local problem depending on a very specific geographical region. Okay, then why is it that all over the world we are very much concerned if something happens in the US or if something happens in India, for example, in our water bodies, or in Japan, then suddenly people start to talk about it. And the reason is that this pollution is no longer a very geographical localized problem, but it is a global problem. Okay, and that is the reason why everybody has to, all the nations over the globe, they have to work together in order to address this problem. So here is only an example to illustrate that point. Because many of these pollutants, including plastics, which I'm going to give you as an example, that these are emission, or there is emission into water or the atmosphere, and as a result of which it also spreads very rapidly. And that is the reason why it assumes an international dimension. Okay, now, for instance, you look at plastic wastes now and marine litter production. Now, all over, if you see, if you know the globe, there is 2/3 of it is really water. And there are approximately, as it shows in the slides right here, that can you see the mouse here? Or should I switch to a laser pointer or something?
We can see. We can see.
Can see the mouse? Okay, okay. So you see almost there are 192 countries which are bordering the Atlantic, the Pacific, the Indian Ocean, and the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. All right. And overall, they produce approximately 2.5 billion metric tons of solid wastes. And this is a number for 2010. All right. So out of the total wastes, solid wastes which are produced by these countries, which are lining these oceans, about 8 million metric tons of plastics, it enters the ocean the same year. Okay. So in other words, although these countries are, these are the coastal countries, but there is a lot of plastic, a lot of solid waste that they're generating. They produce plastics in there. And you see that a lot of it is now, a lot of it is actually entering, and that is what is shown here. So in the lower part of the picture, you see that about 8 million metric tons of plastic goes into the ocean, and then it becomes it circulates all over the globe because of the oceanic currents, because of the northeasterly currents or whatever. All right, so it really enters. So it becomes, in other words, plastic pollution no longer becomes a problem which is restricted only to that particular coastal region, but rather it becomes a global problem, because you could be finding the same thing entering into Indian Ocean, and it could be along the coastline of India. So, and the same thing happens with gases also. So therefore, we say that the pollution is a global problem. So this plastic is, of course, one example here. And in addition to that, there are also cycles, natural cycles, which are operating, for example, carbon. Okay, now by natural cycle of a carbon, what do we mean? Is that when you burn fossil fuel, carbon dioxide is released. And carbon dioxide is also released because of biological respiration, because all living forms across the world are going to emit carbon dioxide as a part of the respiratory system. So this carbon dioxide then enters into the atmosphere from where it is fixed up now by trees or by photosynthetic bacteria which are in the ocean bodies. So it is a part of the natural carbon cycle. Okay. However, because we are increasing the amount of carbon dioxide in nature by burning the fossil fuels, we are also disturbing a natural cycle of carbon. Okay. The same thing with nitrogen also, the same thing with sulfur, because nitrogen is already the gases in the atmosphere. Nitrogen is almost 1/3 of the gases is in the form of nitrogen. And then oxides of nitrogen are also emitted. Oxides of sulfur are also emitted in the atmosphere because of burning of fossil fuel. Okay, and these nitrates or these sulfides, etc., can be taken up to a certain extent by biological system, because nitrate and sulfate, for example, can enter into a biological system, or it can be used as a terminal electron acceptor. So you have some kind of a balance in nature of nitrogen and sulfur. Okay, but then because of fossil fuel emission, you are producing a lot more of nitric oxides, lot more of oxides of sulfur. All right, so that disturbs the natural cycles of these particular elements. Okay. And once it is in the gaseous phase, it can certainly enter into the environment. Okay, so is that clear as to how, for example, the natural cycles of carbon, nitrogen, and sulfur are also likely to be experienced by all over the globe? Is that point clear to everybody?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so similarly, phosphate. Now, phosphate, of course, is released from the rocks, okay, in the form of phosphates, but then, they are taken up, and it is a major element because phosphorus, is a part of the nucleic acids. Okay, DNA, RNA, everything has phosphorus. So these phosphates are taken up inside the cell, then they are released, or they are also released because of weathering problems of rocks and things like that. Okay, however, as I said again, that if there is a disturbance in the natural, like overpopulation, for example, you could be releasing a lot more phosphorus into the environment, which can then not be taken up by plants or by other sources. So again, the natural cycles of these elements becomes a global problem. All right. So therefore, looking at all of these things, we can certainly say, we can conclude that pollution, therefore, is not region specific, it is not country specific, but it is a global problem. Okay, so everybody has to work together in order to address it. Now, today, people have started to talk about what is called as sustainable development. Okay, everywhere in the literature or on any regional, or any global forum, people talk about sustainable development. What exactly does it mean? All of you, I'm sure, you have heard about the term sustainable development, but what does it really mean? Just to give you, because this is a subject by itself, very, very vast. But I just wanted you to understand technically what is the meaning of sustainable development. Okay, so sustainable development can be defined as development that meets the needs of the present. Okay, without compromising the ability of the future generations to meet their own needs. So within this sentence are built two extremely important concepts. One is the needs of the present. So in other words, what is the bare minimum which people require, all right, in order to be able to live without, like, for example, fossil fuel, if you start to consume it too much, okay, there is going to be a compromise on the ability of the future generations to maintain themselves if you consume too much. Okay, so need, for example, what is your need, needs to be understood in the present. And then it also brings in, within this sentence, it brings the concept of limitation, that everything which you are dealing with, okay, is going to be limited, whether it is fossil fuel, whether it is your clean water supplies, etc. All of it is limited. So therefore, you need to understand, what is your need, and only to be able to consume as much so that you leave enough for the future generations. Okay, so two things, therefore, sustainable development means that you should identify what are your needs, you are able to meet your own needs. And number two, everything is limited, so do not overconsume, and leave enough for the future generations to meet their own needs. So these are the two things which are contained within the word sustainable development. That's the way it should be understood. So people started to understand all of this, and eventually, this conference is considered to be very, very important when it comes to environmental safety, environmental concerns. And this was a conference on environment and development of the United Nations in Rio de Janeiro in 1992. Okay, so that is where words like sustainable development came in. And of course, now it is enforced, and people who have signed the treaty, they are supposed to abide by certain norms, so on and so forth. But try to understand, because today I think it's as a person, as a responsible person of a society, you are supposed to know what is the meaning of sustainable development. Now, in this slide, I wanted to show you the multidisciplinary nature of environmental biotechnology. Okay, so although it seems to be composed of a term like environment, and it seems to be composed of a term like biotechnology. Okay, but then we will see that you draw from several disciplines in order to make environmental biotechnology a field which can contribute to the society. Okay, because any engineering discipline which you take up, whether it is civil, mechanical, or biochemical engineering, etc., is to be able to provide a service to the society based on the science which you have already learned. Okay, so that is what the job of an engineer is to deliver this science in its application form to the society. Okay, so what are these sciences in environmental biotechnology? You want to develop technology, and you have to draw out from the disciplines of molecular biology. You have to draw out from the discipline of microbiology, biochemistry. These are the sciences which are behind environmental biotechnology. Okay, and then these, based on whatever you have learned from these disciplines, you apply engineering principles to them and develop some kind of a process. Okay, and eventually, what is the function of all of this? All right, is the restoration of the ecosystem. So please keep, this is what the entire course is going to be structured around: how the knowledge in these particular areas, how engineers can learn from these disciplines and to deliver a process in order to combat some specific problem in the environment. Okay, and eventually, what is the goal of environmental biotechnology is restoration of the ecosystem. So here we bring in fact, if you look through your course contents, ecosystem, understanding of the ecosystem is the first topic in your course. So what do we mean by ecosystem? So you have heard about the term ecosystem. How many of you use this term?
Ma'am, we do ecosystem. We use this term.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Because one could be sitting in an office. So you say all your colleagues and the workings between the different people. Sometimes you say, this is my ecosystem. Okay, but that is really a common man's language. When you talk about ecosystem, which is a technical term, it has a very different connotation. I'm sure many of you have heard of this, even in your high school, your science book, maybe the term was introduced to you. So that's what we are going to learn. So what is the concept of ecosystem and energy transfer in ecosystems? Okay, so when you talk about ecosystem, there are several questions that people are trying to answer or address, and the first is that you need to learn in order to address any other problem is: what are ecosystems? How do they work? How exactly are the specific ecosystems, which I will give you an example of, how are they influenced by very complex, by biotic, what we mean by living, and abiotic, that means the non-living interactions. And when you look at what do we mean by ecosystem, you will also see it has components which are biotic, the living components, and it also has the non-living components. How much stress can they withstand and absorb? Okay, or when will they lose their ability to regenerate? What are the functions of species and species communities in an ecosystem? What exactly do ecosystems provide to the society? Which economic and legal instruments can contribute to reconciling the land use conflicts and maintaining ecosystem functions and services? Okay, so there are, many things which people talk about when you look at the technicality of the term like ecosystem. So let's define first, and then we will try to see. So the way I'm going to explain to you ecosystem is, we will look at what is an ecosystem in the ecological hierarchy, because ecosystem is a word which is coined within the domain of the subject of ecology. So we will see it in the next slide. Then I'll also talk about the set point controls in the ecosystem, unusual members, trophic structures, food chain and metabolic networks, microbial loops, and emergent properties. Okay. So number one, the first point is that the term ecosystem is a part of the larger discipline of ecology. Okay, just as we have microbiology, just as we have biochemistry, or we have molecular biology, in the same way, ecology is a very, very well-defined discipline. Okay, although we don't discuss it in the department, as a core course here, but ecology is a major discipline, very much like biochemistry and all that. And what does it mean? And it is derived. The term ecology is derived from the Latin word oikos, which means household, and logos, that means study. So ecology is actually the study of the household. In household, the term environment is also included. Okay, so it is environment and organisms, and it is only as early as 1869 that the term ecology, as we understand it presently, was coined by Ernst Haeckel. And what it means is the study of the natural environment, including the relationship of organisms to one another and to their surroundings. Okay, so now ecosystem is actually part of the discipline of ecology. So let's see where an
Ma'am.
ecosystem, yeah, go on.
Yeah, ma'am, I'm asking like ecology, the term ecology was coined in 1869, when we have started using the term environmental biotechnology, like when this discipline developed.
Environmental bio, as I said, in one of my earlier slides, I had told you that when you look at really environmental biotechnology, okay, biotechnology doesn't mean only using sophisticated tools. It means anytime when you are going to use biological systems in order to address an environmental issue, that is environmental biotechnology. And the early, like I said, like towards the end of the 19th century, they started to see that the wastewaters, the domestic wastewaters, okay, could be treated in the wastewater treatment plant if there were certain microorganisms, which nobody started. Actually, if wastewater, that time there was no collection of the domestic sewage and all that, people would just dispose it out into the outside of the house. But very soon they started to see that microorganisms, they had started to grow in that domestic wastewaters. And as a result of the growth of the microorganisms, this water became much cleaner. The wastewaters which were released from the house, they became much cleaner. So they started to identify what kind of microorganisms are these, what is their biochemistry. So you can say environmental biotechnology actually started from that time, when people started to see the role, or they started to develop these microbial consortia in order to inoculate these wastewaters, and to see that they became much cleaner after microorganisms started to grow in them. So you can say very
Ma'am, but
safely.
I wanted to know, like, when did it come into the books and in literature?
Well, in the literature, I think early 20th century, you will see that there is mention of environmental biotechnology in the literature.
Okay.
Okay, all right. So we go back and, we say, I had just moved to this. So now, we were at a point when we wanted to define what is an ecosystem. Okay, so if you see the figure on the left, you see ecosystem is shown as a pie somewhere here. All right, and this ecosystem is a part of a much larger ecological hierarchy. Okay, so if you now look at any biological system or a biological world, you start with molecules, then many of these molecules will get together to make a cell. Okay, different types of cells will come together to make a tissue. Okay, for example, you have the tissues of the kidney, or you have a liver tissue, or you could have the heart tissue, or whatever. So the tissues will get together to give rise to a specific organ. Like for a higher system like man, for example, so kidney is an organ, liver is an organ, heart is an organ, etc. So different organs will get together to make an organism. Okay, different organisms will come together to make what is called as a population. But in population, what we consider is that the population means that it is the same types of organisms which have come together to make a population. Okay, now graphical representation of the same hierarchy is also shown in the figure which you see on the right. Okay, so again, I will go back and I will explain. You start with the molecules. That is what is shown here. Okay, and you make a molecule like water, for example, which starts with atom. Then these molecules are now inside the cell, like you see here, for example. And then in the cells, different cells will get together to make a tissue. So you have like a bone. Okay, and it makes an organ. Then you have a complete body system or an organism. Okay, and this is what you are. So system is like, a skeletal system is shown here. So an organism is shown here, okay, which is very much equivalent to what is shown here. Okay, so different organisms, like in this case animals, which are elephants, they will get together to make a population which is equivalent to this. Population makes for a community. So within the community, for example, you can have elephants, you can have giraffes, you have other things, plus you have other kind of microbes and trees and what have you. And all of these community, for example, together they live in what is called as an ecosystem. Okay, so these are the communities when they live in any specific area, constantly interacting with each other, then it defines an ecosystem. Okay, and that is what is shown here. All right, then when you look at the ecological hierarchy, okay, then the discipline of ecology begins, for example, where populations start. Okay, just below this, for example, when you talk about molecules, you talk about molecular biology. When you talk about cells, you talk about cell biology. You talk about their functioning, the biochemistry, the microbiology. All of those disciplines, they live exactly at these locations, at the level of molecules, at the level of cell. But the discipline of ecology starts when you start to talk about populations, communities, the ecosystem, the landscape. What do we mean by landscape, for example? So landscape originally meant a painting. Many people used to paint and all that, where you had the mountains, where you had where you could have the plain grass and all that. That was called as a landscape. Okay, but landscape is also now an acceptable scientific term in the field of ecology. Okay, so what is a landscape? It's a heterogeneous area which is composed of a cluster of interacting ecosystems. This is only one ecosystem. You go a little bit far away and you could be dealing with the desert. Desert is a different ecosystem altogether. Or at the base of the hill, it's a different ecosystem. Okay, so that is why we need to understand what is the term ecosystem. Anyway, so so this is the term landscape here, where different ecosystems are interacting. Okay, and then above the landscape, you have a term which is called as biome. So biome is used. Yeah, go on.
how will we define the boundary of an ecosystem? Like how will define that this is one ecosystem and now here this is another ecosystem?
Absolutely. So let me just, all that is explained in the next slide. So let me just finish this picture in order to make you understand where ecosystem resides within the larger hierarchy of ecology. Okay, so, let me finish all of these first. So biome, so what is biome? Biome is used for a large regional or subcontinental system which is characterized by a major vegetation type or other landscape aspect, the temperate forest biome, the continental shelf ocean biome, etc. And all the biomes, for example, when they come together, you talk about ecosphere. So Earth entirely, for example, can be considered as an ecosphere. Okay, so I would just like you to, for example, understand, because each one of these terms has a very, very special meaning, and we are going to be focusing on the ecosystem. So now, what is an ecosystem? So it is defined as any unit which includes all the organisms, that is the microbes, the terrestrial, the aquatic organisms, which will be now the biotic community or the living community. So a unit which includes all the biotic component in a given area, which interacts with the physical environment or the abiotic environment in such a manner that there is a flow of energy which leads to clearly defined biotic structure and cycling of materials between living and non-living components. That is called as an ecological system or an ecosystem. Okay, in order to summarize, in order to illustrate, what do we mean by that? A pond, for example, a pond is an ecosystem. Okay, now a forest, for example, within the forest, if there is a pond, if there is a small water body, okay, that is not dependent on the forest, but within the pond, within the lake itself, it is complete by itself. And that is where we have to understand, what do we mean by complete in itself? Okay, there are two things which must be satisfied in an ecosystem. First of all, there has to be a flow of energy. Okay, so that flow of energy comes from the sun, and it flows through different kind of systems within that ecosystem, so that there is a very clearly defined biotic structure. Okay, and I will explain to you what do we mean by a biotic structure. So there has to be a clearly defined biotic structure, and there has to be a cycling of materials between living and the non-living component. Only then it can satisfy itself as an ecosystem. Okay, before I come back to this slide, let me go to the next one. Okay, so diagrammatically, for example, any ecosystem is defined as a functional, it's a system unit, and this is an ecosystem what is defined here. It is delimited, that means it doesn't have a very clear-cut boundary. It is an open system. Like it says, ecosystems are functionally open systems. What enters into this system is because energy always has to be entering into an ecosystem. Okay, so sun, for example, is the source of energy which enters into the ecosystem, but any ecosystem is not necessarily dependent on sun. There could be other forms of energy also. For example, you could have a coastal ecosystem where wind energy also enters into the system. Or you could have some other form of energy which is entering into the system. But that is extremely important. Energy has to enter, materials and other organisms have to enter into an, into an ecosystem. And there is a definite output. That is, for example, processed energy. What does it mean? Processed energy could be food. It could be the waste products which are given out by the living organisms. All of these will be now the output from the system. Or it could be immigration of organisms. Now, even a society, for example, a small community, for example, can be considered as an ecosystem, provided, it can satisfy all of these other terms which are listed here. Okay, so in an ecosystem, for example, there are no clearly defined boundaries. All right, so energy and other forms of energy, materials and biological systems, organisms, people, etc., they constantly enter into the ecosystem, and processed energy leaves immigration of organisms, etc. But you know, within all of this is a system which is a dynamically self-adjusting system. So there is a delicate balance, in other words. How many organisms can enter, what kind of organisms can enter, all right, or what kind of other energies, etc., can enter into a system, because you know this is a system which can only accept, it has only a limited buffering capacity. It has only a limited buffering capacity. So if you are talking about, you know, a population living in a certain area, you know, people cannot be entering indefinitely into that system, because sooner or later then that is going to collapse. And so therefore, you know, we are talking about the biological ecosystems, but ecosystem is a term which, like, you know, I said that it is a term which is also used. It could be within a community, it could be within an office space, or it could be, you know, anywhere. It could be just anywhere, but the principles of ecosystem are always going to remain the same. And that's what you need to look at, because first you need to understand technically what does the term ecosystem really mean. Okay, so these are functionally open systems. In other words, I'll go back to the last slide and I will show you what other structure is there which you need to consider. But in this slide, what you need to understand that ecosystems are functionally open systems, like you see. Okay, things are constantly entering into that, things are constantly exiting from the ecosystem. And considering both the input environment as well as the output environment is a very important part of the concept. So let me go back here. All right. So this is the larger term which you now understand as to, you know, what do we mean? So the example which is shown here is that of a pond. Okay, so a small pond like you see here, for example, can be considered as an ecosystem. Okay, but then what does it define? You know, there are two components in an ecosystem. In the technical ecological term, one is the biotic or the living component, and the other is the abiotic component, which is the non-living component, which is an integral part of an ecosystem. What are the abiotic factors are shown here on the top. This is light, for example, heat, water, and minerals, etc. So these are the non-living components. Okay, and the biotic or the living factors, the living things which are organized there, are arranged in a certain manner in an ecosystem. It is not haphazard system. Okay, so the biotic factors or the living system is organized in a certain structure. The first is called as a producer. Okay, so there have to be systems like algae or plants which are able to capture the solar energy and basically solar energy, because you know the input, because we say that there is a flow of energy in a very clearly defined fashion in an ecosystem. Okay, so that flow of energy, the ultimate source of that energy is the sun, like is shown here. Is that point clear to everybody? You know, I want to make sure that, because there are many new concepts which are coming here at technical level. So do you understand, for example, what are the abiotic and what are the biotic factors?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
So other students in the class, please be interactive. I cannot see you, so you know I have to trust that you understand. Kavya, you're also in the class? I didn't see the complete list. Are you there? Ravinder, Kavya? Other students? So I hope everybody understands. Okay. So,
Ma'am, I had a question.
yeah.
Does the energy input, suppose in a particular ecosystem, the energy input and output is total sum of energy input and output is zero? Means
Certainly. So that kind of a status cannot be maintained for very long. Okay, you know, you're trying to say that maybe a steady state. I mean, does an
yes,
ecosystem really reach a steady state? Okay, you can say it does reach, but it's not the steady state which you put in a for example in a bioreactor. Okay, because there the boundaries are very, very limited. The buffering capacity of that particular system is very low. You know, you are going to put nutrients, you are going to put something into it. Output could be your product, could be your enzyme which you are trying to harvest. There the boundaries are very well defined. But when you talk about an ecological ecosystem, the boundaries are very fluid. Okay, and the buffering is great. They are able to, you know, these are huge, they have huge buffering systems. Okay,
Okay.
so it can be, you know, yeah, but you know what you call as really zero is a difference of very, very large terms, large amounts of energy coming in, large amounts going, and within that zone they can maintain. When you say zero, you say that you are able to maintain a steady state, fine. Okay, but the boundaries of that, the range of that steady state is huge in an ecosystem.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, that's what we need to understand. All right, so now, you know, let me go back, because, you know, we talked about, for example, here I have highlighted the biotic community and the abiotic. So abiotic factors I have already discussed. Amongst the biotic, which are the living factors, there is a clear hierarchy in terms of the energy status at every level. So the first level is what is called as a producer. So in any ecosystem, there has to be a producer organism. And what are these? These are the plants which you see here. For example, at the base of the pond, there are these plants. Then there are these small green photosynthetic bacteria. There could be algae, etc., which are able to capture the solar energy, because that is the ultimate energy source. They are able to capture it, and algae are produced, small bacteria are produced, or whatever. Okay, so this group is called the first level, where the energy is captured, is called as a producer. Then there is a primary consumer. So these primary consumers are the one which are going to feed on algae and on the small bacteria, which are photosynthetic bacteria. They are all eaten up. The algae are all eaten up. They are constantly reproducing. They are constantly being eaten up by the primary consumer. Then these worms and other things are eaten up by the secondary consumer, like fish or whatever. And finally, there is a tertiary consumer, like the big animals. Okay, so you have, you know, whales and you have everything. So they are called as tertiary consumers, which feed on these small fish. And the fish intermediary are the ones. So, you know, the secondary consumer will be something which feeds on things which are actually eating up the producers. Okay, whales and other things, they do not eat the primary consumer. They only eat the secondary consumer. Okay, so therefore, among the biotic factors, what we have learned, therefore, that in an ecosystem, in the biotic factors, you have a producer, algae and plants. Then you have all of these which are called as the consumers, which are called as either the primary consumer, the secondary consumers, and the tertiary consumers. And at the same time, there are also decomposers. Okay, and these decomposers are like saprophytic fungi, etc., which can feed on any one of them. Okay, they can feed on the dead, because all of these, you see, decomposers, and today we understand that, you know, the secondary and the tertiary consumer, they are all eating living things. Okay, but the decomposers, etc., they are feeding on the dead matter, because, you know, they are going to die. Not all of them are going to be consumed. Fish are also going to die. Not all of them are consumed. Okay, so therefore the role of decomposers in the ecosystem is very, very important. They feed themselves on the dead and decaying organic matter. They don't eat plants. They can't eat, you know, they will only decompose them, and therefore there is a certain energy flow which goes from sun all the way up to the tertiary consumer. Okay, so is that clear to everybody? All right, so therefore, you know, I will come back,
Yes,
and
ma'am.
so therefore, so we say, so now, you know, if only if you satisfy all of these components, that is, there has to be non-living factors, there have to be living factors, which have to be organized in an energy chain as a producer, as a primary, secondary, tertiary consumer, etc. If they are organized in this fashion, only then that particular area can be called as an ecosystem. They must fulfill all of these criteria. So there has to be a flow of energy, which leads to clearly defined biotic structure. What is that structure? That is the producer, the primary, the secondary, the tertiary consumer. There has to be a cycling of materials, because what you see here is that between living and non-living components, so all of these arrows which you see here, for example, are, something decomposes, then carbonates are released by fungi, etc. Then these are taken up by the plants. So there is a recycling of nutrients also taking place here. So it's extremely important, therefore, to understand if you satisfy all of these things, only then that geographical region can be defined as an ecosystem. So when I give an example, for instance, so this we have already discussed. So things like pond can be called as an ecosystem because within that ecosystem, it meets all the criteria which is required. Only then you can call it as an ecosystem. A lake is an ecosystem. Then you have marine ecosystems like oceans, for example, are called as marine ecosystems. Or tropical rainforests along the Amazon River in South America is an ecosystem. Coral reefs, for example, are called as ecosystems because they meet all the criteria which we have listed down. Okay, so eventually, therefore, our job, therefore, is to understand that. So what we will do, we will take a break at 10:25 in 10 minutes and then reassemble at 10:30. Okay. So therefore, whenever you talk about a discipline like environmental biotechnology, and I had projected that you say restoration of the ecosystem. So it's not a piecemeal. If there is, for example, the farmland, etc. If it has, for example, it's not working properly, then the idea is not that you just supply some nitrogen, you put some you put some fertilizers in there, or you do reforestation. आपने कहीं एकदम forest में deforestation कर दिया, and then you just put some 100 trees and you think you have done your job. Okay, because it's not that. It is the restoration of the ecosystem. Not only do you have to worry about the primary producer level, but you also have to see that everything in that system is restored. So as an environmental biotechnologist, therefore, it is important that all the technologies are used in a manner to restore the ecosystem. Not just do a piecemeal patch here, a patch there, 100 trees here, new lake, new water bodies are introduced somewhere and you think you have done your job. No, we always say restoration of the ecosystem, because ecosystem is very, very complex. It has so many components, so everything needs to be taken care of. Now I'm going to apprise you, familiarize you with some kind of very special properties of the ecosystems which you should be aware of. Now, the first point here is what is called as a set point control. Okay, so I will take you back to the same graph which I illustrated earlier to you. All right, now there are two terms which are important here. One is called as a homeostasis and the other is called as homeoresis. Okay, now in this entire scheme of things, when you look at all the life forms, etc., okay, up to the level of organism, there are set point controls. That is, there is very exact genetic information. When you talk about higher forms, there is a hormonal control, there is a neural control on growth and development. Okay, so up to the level of organism, okay, the body is very well regulated. There is a very nice buffer. There is very exact control in the system, and there is a positive feedback. There is a negative feedback, which maintains a steady state within the limits of the organism. So you can take excess of food. It doesn't disturb your system. You're able to digest it out properly, or so on and so forth. So there are very exact control mechanisms which are operating. But when you look at population upwards, okay, there are no set point controls. Okay, how do you really maintain a balance at this particular level? No set point control. Okay, the feedback, there is no feedback control, positive and negative, which can very, very rapidly respond to the external environment. Okay, so many of these systems, ecosystems, landscapes, the biomes, they are called as self-adjusting systems. They are called as pulsing states. Okay, so they change from one pulse to another. However, everything operates within certain limits. So they are called as pulsating states. They are not as exact as up to the organism level. And that is the reason we say that there is no set point control in the ecosystem. Okay. So there is some background. Would somebody please switch off the microphone? Excuse me, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Would everybody please shut their microphones off? Because I think with somebody there is some noise coming in the background. Okay. So therefore, in an ecosystem, there is no exact control like we have in the case of an organism. All right. It just maintains the flow. There is no equilibrium, but there are pulsing balances. Okay. So therefore, failure to recognize this difference in the control system has resulted in much confusion about the balance of nature. Okay, so therefore we need to understand what is happening up to an organism level, but after that, it's a very, very dynamic system. Uh, then now, in this, I just wanted to give you an example of some kind of a buffer of an ecosystem and how many of them they can rebound back. Okay, many of them cannot, but many ecosystems can also bounce back. And the example which I have shown you here is that of the coral reef. So everybody has heard about coral reefs?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so these are generally like these are solid calcium carbonate deposits which take different forms, like you see here, along coastal areas. So these are called as the coral reefs. Okay, now here is a natural coral reef where you see, for example, and because coral reefs are also, just like we saw ponds are ecosystems, the coral reef is also an ecosystem. Okay, so you see these hardened kind of calcium carbonate deposits which take different forms of shape, but then they are differently colored. Okay, so you see something which is like in yellow color, which is something which is in red color. So they are very, very colorful, as many of you must have seen in the pictures, and sometimes ornaments are also made out of coral reefs. So these are the systems. Now, coral reef is a system which has, which is extremely important as far as the ocean or the marine environment is concerned. And these are the ecosystems which can recover rather quickly from destruction, but only up to a certain level. Okay, so here is an example of what global warming can do to these coral reefs. Okay, so you see that they are no longer colored, but they are all gray. And why have they become like this? And this is because of the rising, these are the reasons are given here, that the delicate coral reef ecosystem in the South Pacific is at risk due to rising ocean temperatures as the ocean temperatures rise. Okay, all these coral reefs, they also undergo a decoloration. So they are no longer brightly colored as they are in a normal coral reef. Okay, and also because of decreased salinity, because sometimes in those coastal areas there is a lot of water discharge from industries or whatever, so the normal salinity which is there also goes low, as a result of which these coral reefs, they undergo bleaching, they lose their colors. Okay, so what is the consequence of that? The corals will bleach or they will lose their bright colors in water which is too warm. They die in the water that isn't salty enough. And without the reef structure, the ecosystem collapses. The organisms such as algae, seagrass, animals, etc., they will start to disappear. Okay. However, this kind of a system has an ability to bounce back, okay, which is not the capacity of the other ecosystems. All right. And you may wonder as to what is the importance of these coral reefs. So some points are listed here. For example, because the coral reef as an ecosystem exhibits very high biodiversity, and it has photosynthetic animals inside, small organisms which are capable of fixing carbon dioxide. So they play an important role in consumption of carbon dioxide which is in the ocean. So there is CO2 fixation, there is nutrient recycling by the coral reef. They also serve the organisms which are living in these coral reefs. These are only calcium carbonate deposits which have a solid structure, but inside them there are life forms which are living, which serve as a food for fish. They perform an important function of water filtration, food security, so on and so forth. Okay, so here is an example of a very, very rare system which is able to bounce back. But many of the other ecosystems cannot necessarily bounce back. Okay, so what we will do now is that we will just take a break for 5 minutes and reassemble at 10:30.
Okay, ma'am.
Okay, okay.
ये तो बड़ा बढ़िया है, तो मैं भी बैठ के सुन सकता हूँ।
हाँ,
हमारे यहाँ भी जो हम लोग
Okay, so are the students back?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so
Yes, ma'am.
let's, okay, fine, fine. So let's go to the next slide now. So please read, there is a lot of information on this slide. So just read it, and in order to understand what we have just talked about. So the third point which I wanted to talk about is the trophic structure, which is, we have already looked at, for example, what are the producers, what are the primary consumers, etc. But if you look at the energy transfer at every level, the structure is organized in the form of a pyramid where producers are at the base of the pyramid. So you have plants, algae, cyanobacteria, which are the producers, which let us say make up for about 1,000 units in terms of the energy that they are producing. But if you look at now the consumers, the primary consumer, for example, which are insects, mice, or rabbits which live on these producers, there is only 1/10 of the energy which gets transferred to the next trophic level. So if you had 1,000 units of energy here, by the time you come to the primary consumer level, there is only 100 units of that energy. So only 10% of that passes to the next level. Similarly, if we look at now the secondary consumers, there is only 1/10 of it which you find here. And eventually the tertiary consumer, for example, what you see at the top, carries forward only 1/10 of this. So at every step, okay, there is the flow of energy. It's not like 100% of the energy gets carried forward. Only 10% of the energy, and the rest, is lost either as a dying matter or it is lost as heat. Okay, just like in any other system. So what we see now at each trophic level, in other words, at each one of these levels, only some energy is available as a food, and only 10% of energy is picked up for the next level. 90% of the energy is lost through life processes such as respiration, movement, and excretion, etc. The number of living organisms that can be supported at that second trophic level is always going to be lesser compared to that what you had at the level which was just below it. So all of these levels are defined here, which we have already discussed. And now, there is another concept which is introduced here, that, while we move from one trophic level to another, there is only 10% of energy utilization. Okay, but if we were to look at microbes in each one of these trophic levels, for example, then they are far more energy efficient between each other. And that is the point which is shown here, that purely microbial food chains are far more efficient. That is, if you just look at, the photosynthetic bacteria, which is able to fix the solar energy, then you again look at protozoa, which are also microbes, but which feed on them. Okay, then you can have as much as 20 to 40% of the consumed bacterial mass can be turned into a protozoan cell mass. So I hope this point is clear to everybody. Okay, so if within this energy pyramid, if we are only trying to look at the microbes which are residing here, for instance, at this level, you could have photosynthetic bacteria, which are actually microbes. At the consumer level, you could have protozoa, which are again microbes. Then they can carry as much as 20 to 40% of the energy is taken forward. But if you look at insects, or if you look at bigger animals, etc., and that makes sense, because in order for insects to survive, mice to survive, or rabbits to survive, for example, these are much bigger organisms. So their own consumption of the nutrients, etc., is much larger, and they are only able to assimilate a very small part, which is 10%. Okay, so make sure that you understand, what is the meaning of this last sentence here. Now, within these ecosystems, okay, there are at every trophic level, there is a very complex food chain and a metabolic network which also exists. Because the larger structures we have already seen, like you have the producers, you have the primary consumers, and you have the secondary. But at every trophic level also, if you just look at the primary consumer level, you will see that there is a lot of crosstalk also which is happening between these organisms. And these are also equally important. for an ecosystem to function properly. For example, now there could be some extracellular metabolites which are produced by microbes, which are not necessarily the photosynthetic microbes, but these are the ones which could be feeding on the microbes. Okay. So these extracellular metabolites which are being released by the microbes which are at the primary consumer level could be the carbon compounds, and this encourages a competition for common substrates and cooperation through metabolic interactions. So a lot of other microorganisms could be there which could feed themselves on the metabolites which are released by these microbes. Okay, I hope that point is clear. Now, for instance, I have just cited an example here. For example, the cyanobacteria, which are photosynthetic microorganisms, and other bacteria, which are nitrogen fixing bacteria, they produce molecular hydrogen, they produce acetate, they can also produce methane. Okay, for example, cyanobacteria can produce hydrogen, it can also produce acetic acid, etc. Okay, and all of these metabolites at that particular trophic level, it is very necessary for these particular metabolites also to be consumed by other set of microorganisms like methanogens, acetogens, sulfate reducers, and aerobic hydrogen oxidizing bacteria. Okay, so all of these metabolic exudates which are released, they need to be consumed at the same trophic level by other set of microorganisms. Now, the hydrogen which I said is produced by cyanobacteria, it needs to be removed by methanogens which can use hydrogen. They also fix carbon dioxide and they can produce methane. Now, this removal of hydrogen by methanogens is very essential to sustain anaerobic degradation of the plant tissue. Otherwise, the equilibrium is shifted towards formation of toxic fatty acids. Okay, so in this particular reaction, what you see is that the hydrogens which is produced by cyanobacteria, okay, can be combined by a group of microorganisms here, okay, which can consume hydrogen, which can consume carbon dioxide, and just remove all of these materials and produce something else in the environment. Okay, so therefore at every trophic level there is a crosstalk. I think the point which should be understood by this in this slide is that there is a crosstalk at every trophic level. Okay, so these the some features therefore of such kind of food chain and metabolic network is that they provide flow of energy as well as matter between the organisms and also the abiotic environment. Metabolic exchange occurs within the same trophic level of osmotrophic, that is the organisms which are exactly at the same trophic level. They could be at the primary consumer level. So there is a metabolic exchange which also occurs while the food chain or the food web is responsible for the flow of energy between different trophic levels. The efficiency of energy conversion by osmotrophic organisms can be analyzed through growth stoichiometry. Okay, so all of these things can be quantified, and many of you have already done the stoichiometry of growth and all that. So at every stage, for example, at every stage, quantitative principles can be applied in order to know that what kind of metabolites are made and how these are incorporated by living organisms, and such growth stoichiometries can also be analyzed. So any questions at this stage?
No, ma'am.
No, ma'am.
Okay, so then let's move to the next feature, which is that of a microbial loop. Now you should understand that many of these things which we are talking about, like the metabolic interactions, food chains, the trophic levels, etc., these are all properties of the ecosystems. So having microbial loops is also an important property of the ecosystem. Okay, what do we mean by a microbial loop? Now, here is a picture in which you see, for example, a plant, and once the plant gets old or it decomposes, there is plant litter on the ground, then microbes are going to consume, and finally, so these could be the primary consumers, these could be the secondary consumers, animals, etc. They are going to feed on some of these small plants, and so these are the animals here. Okay, now this is what you would expect in a normal trophic structure. However, apart from this, there are certain other microbial loops which also operate. For example, the plants, they will give out plant exudates. So through roots, there are minerals, there are certain other materials which are
You're not audible.
You're not audible.
Ma'am, you are not audible.
Hello.
Now you are audible.
Okay, okay. So I'll have to upload my PPT. I think something just went wrong with the connection momentarily. Is the recording still on? Yeah, recording is on. All right. So getting back to this slide. All right. So in addition to the normal trophic level here, all right, there are also these kind of microbial loops
Slide
which
is
are
not.
operating. So plants, slide has not come.
No, no. Now it has come.
Okay, okay, all right, all right. So you see the plant exudates which are given off on which certain microbes can feed. So that is what we mean by having microbial loops in the ecosystem. Okay, so apart from the normal trophic levels which I have already discussed with you, there are these kind of loops also which are operating. Then the other point which is written here is what is called as the emergent property. Okay, so in an ecosystem, for example, there are new kind of properties which are also emerging out, which is not a sum total of the individual organisms which are existing there. All right, so what do we mean by the emergent property principle of an ecosystem? In order to draw an analogy, let's take the example that when hydrogen and oxygen combine, they make water. Okay, but the properties of water are very different from that of either hydrogen or oxygen. Okay, so I think this is a very easy example to understand that in an ecosystem also, we talked about having plants, we talked about having the primary consumer, the secondary, the tertiary consumer. All right, but then what is the outcome in an ecosystem of all of these is something over and above the properties of the individual components. That is what the emergent property principle means. And if you draw if you try to understand what do we mean by that, you can take this as an example. So in the ecological world, therefore, there is an emergent property principle. The example which I'm going to give you here again is that of a coral reef. Okay, so here is a coral reef. Again, we talked a lot about it. And here, the algae, which are the photosynthetic algae, and the coelantrates, which are actually small animals, polyps, which are attached to the substrate. Okay, now both of these animals, they evolved together to make a coral. Okay, which you see here, all of these structures, they cannot be made independently by either algae or by coelantrates. It's only when both of these systems they come together, okay, can they make something like a coral, which is an efficient nutrient cycling mechanism. And this maintains a high rate of productivity in waters which have otherwise very low nutrient content, because you have the algae which is able to feed itself on the light, whatever is penetrating at that level. There are different wavelengths which are entering at that particular depth where corals are existing. So those photosynthetic algae are able to take only that wavelength of light. They are able to capture nitrogen from the sea waters and they produce organic matter. This organic matter is then consumed by these by polyps, which are able to secrete calcium carbonate outside. Okay, and this is the calcium carbonate which gets deposited. And they have there are different types of photosynthetic algae or whatever, and that's the reason why the color in these also varies. Okay, so in order to understand the emergent property principle, this would be one of the very, very good examples that the property of a coral is very different from that of either algae or these coelantrates. So is that clear as to what do we mean by the emergent property principle?
Yes, ma'am.
Ma'am, can you explain again?
Okay, see what we mean is that in an ecosystem, All right. There are properties, there are new kind of properties which you are likely to see in an ecosystem, which is not necessarily the property of the individuals which are in there. Okay. But something happens in addition to the individual properties. To give you an example, like in the physical world, the best example would be to see that when hydrogen and oxygen combine, they make water. But the properties of water, as I said, is very different from that of either hydrogen or oxygen. You know, both of these are gases and they have so many different properties compared to that of water. Similarly, in an ecosystem, okay, hydrogen could be like a primary consumer, oxygen could be equivalent to a secondary consumer. However, in the ecosystem, when these are together, there are new kind of things which are happening because of interactions between these different things. It is not a simple energy transfer. It is not simply the grazing or the eating of the secondary consumer of the primary consumer. But when they are together, there are kind of interactions which are happening, okay, which you will not be able to notice if these two, you know, were independently residing elsewhere. That is the emergent property principle. So I hope that point is clear now.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, okay. All right, so that is all we have for today. So I'm going to close, and please have a look at it. Go over the slides will be again posted. So I will remove the first one, and the first and the second is going to be combined, and then it'll be available to you. Okay, so any questions so far?
Ma'am, I have one question, two questions.
Yeah.
So, ma'am, the question is like when we talk about ecosystem, Deepak talked about like energy input and energy output. So, like we know that in an ecosystem there must be living organisms and there must be non-living or non-living things. So, in case of living things, we know that like whether it is a individual cell or a multicellular organisms like human, it always remains in unequilibrium, never becomes in equilibrium. Like if it will become in equilibrium, it will we can say that it is dead. So in
Right.
that case, like I think that input should never be equal to output. Energy input should never be equal to output. Ma'am, if I'm right, I just wanted to know.
Certainly. See, because, you know, I think after you looked at the trophic structure, you saw that a lot more energy is going in compared to that of output, because at every level, as energy transmits itself through an ecosystem, okay, you have like the solar energy, which is always in plenty. So it is unidirectional. A lot of energy comes through the solar energy, passes through a primary, secondary, and a tertiary consumer, or through decomposers. It leaves the system. But remember that, you know, everything is supported at the end of the day. Everything gets supported by the solar energy. So the input of energy will always be more, and output of, so that's the reason why you can't say it is in an equilibrium, because, you know, you have a lot more energy which is entering into the system than leaving the system. But it is in an equilibrium, you know, that dynamic equilibrium is always maintained. So how much nutrient, or how much energy can enter in, because, you know, you look at, for example, if there is a flood, or if there is too much of wind is also an energy. The entire system is going to be wiped out. The entire system, the entire ecosystem, if there is too much of energy, which is as an input into the ecosystem, even then the ecosystem is going to perish.
Yes, ma'am.
Do you understand?
Ma'am,
Like
then
you look at a planet like Mercury, which is very close to the sun. I mean, there is no dearth of energy there, but then there are no ecosystems there. So everything has
yes,
to be
ma'am.
just in balance. And of course, the point should be understood that the energy entering into the system and exiting the system are, they could be, you know, in some kind of a momentary equilibrium, but eventually, it is not a self-sustaining system until the sun energy constantly goes into the ecosystem. Only then it can survive. Okay, what is the
Yes,
second
ma'am.
question, Ratnesh, very quickly?
So, ma'am, the second question was like, we know that like there is a term called human microbiome. So that is about biome. So biome is a bigger system than ecosystem. So can we consider like that there are ecosystems in human microbiome, and if we can consider like then what will be ecosystems inside a human?
No, because I don't think so, because there is no primary producer there. Because biome term is very, very restricted, and it doesn't have the same meaning as an ecological system means or as an ecosystem means. Because although there could be hierarchy in food, but then where is the primary producer? Because eventually everybody understands that an ecosystem, okay, you don't have photosynthetic microorganisms in your mouth. You have only, these are all consumers. They are all consumer. There is no producer in there. So therefore, biome has a very limited, it cannot be called as an ecosystem.
Yes,
Okay,
yes.
all right, fine. So now we'll come back and we will meet on Monday.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am.
Okay, fine.